All right, well, let's start with these announcements. Homework 14 you have until tonight at 11:59 p.m. I have a couple of hints I'm going to give you on that assignment in just a moment. And then our final exam is 1 week from today. In fact, a week from today you'll just be finishing up because the final exam will need to be submitted to Blackboard no later than 12:15 p.m. The conditions of the exam are the same as our previous exams have been. It's an open book, open note test, and you'll access it on Blackboard, and it should be submitted on Blackboard before the deadline. And during the exam, you shouldn't collaborate with other people. What you submit should be exclusively your work. You shouldn't refer to any websites during the test. And just to let you know, the exam is comprehensive, but there will be added emphasis on the material since our last midterm exam. And so what that means is that we had exam 2 during, it was on April 2nd, and any material after that will have proportionally more points, and there may be additional questions compared to the earlier material. But the nature of this course is that everything progressively builds on the foundation of what came before. So there definitely will be some questions where I'm just asking the simple time value of money stuff, you know, like find A given P and those types of questions. So you should, as you prepare for the exam, go through a thorough and comprehensive review of everything in the course. Chad says, can't you make it over the stuff from the start of the semester? That stuff was easier. Yes, it was. It was a little bit simpler. And you will get some of those easy questions, but you'll get some of the recent stuff as well. So we've gone through the outcome survey already. If you didn't already do the course evaluation, and that's the survey that you complete through MyMU, and that's the one where you can provide comments about the instructor. If you haven't done that yet, I would once again invite your feedback. I really feel like student comments are an important way for instructors to improve, and I sincerely want this class to be as good as possible. And I mean, you can never make learning easy per se, but you can definitely meet the students and provide them the tools that they need to find success on their own. Chad asks, do you want us to show you that when you finish it? And the answer is no. I don't need to see that you finished the survey. I would just appreciate it if you do. Okay, now in a normal semester we would have 42 lectures, but because of all of the ice storms we had this semester, there's only 38. And so we've had to cut out a couple of subjects that are normally in the course and consolidate a couple of lectures together. And today is one of those where we're combining topics, depreciation and taxes. In a normal semester, we'd spend a week on those topics, but unfortunately, because of the ice storms, we only get a single day to cover them. Before we get into Chapter 16 and 17 material, I wanted to give you a couple of hints from the homework assignment that's due tonight at 11:59 p.m. So on problem 7, that is related to a concept that we won't have gone through in an in-class exercise. And remember, at the beginning of the semester I told you that the majority of the questions that you'll get on homework assignments will be maybe a step beyond what we had in an in-class exercise, where the ICE problem was kind of an easy application and then the homework problem is an extension of that. But I did warn you at that time that not every homework problem through the whole semester is something where you would have had a previous practice with. And problem 7 is one of those. But the good news is problem 7 isn't particularly challenging. The way that it works is that the problem is telling you the indirect cost factor, and that's a fractional, like a decimal value, and a direct cost factor. And so what this idea is saying is that you can predict the total cost of a project, C sub t, by knowing the cost of one component and then extrapolating upward on the basis of that one piece that you do know. So you add together all of the direct cost factors, multiply it by the cost of the one piece of equipment you do know, and then outside of that bracket, you'll notice that you're adding on the effective direct costs. So Rebecca's saying, already turned your assignment in. Yeah, you can submit up until 11:59 p.m. and the grader will just score the last assignment that you submitted. So if you do resubmit, be sure that you turn in everything over again. Don't just submit the one thing that you've changed, submit everything. Okay, so that's problem 7, and then for problem 8, you use this formula. Now problem 8 is a way of estimating the cost when you've got difference in sizes. So for example, if you have cost data from something small, like you're trying to use the cost data from a small wastewater treatment plant to predict what would be the cost of making a large wastewater treatment plant, what this formula does is it tells you how you can extrapolate on the basis of size. And I mean, it's pretty straightforward, except for this one thing called the correlating exponent. And the correlating exponent is related to nonlinearities in cost and pricing data. So the way to understand that is that if you buy a bag of flour at the store, it would maybe cost you 20 cents a pound for flour if you just buy it by, like a 5-pound bag. But if you buy an entire rail car of flour, then you're going to get a discount, a bulk discount. So it's going to be cheaper per pound if you buy something in large quantities. And so when you've got a correlating exponent less than 1, that means that there is an economy of scale, and that making a bigger thing, like doubling the size of the thing, isn't necessarily going to double the cost. It will be less than double the cost if you have a correlating exponent that's less than 1. But if the correlating exponent is greater than 1, then that means that there is a penalty for making something larger. And occasionally that happens if, for example, you're building a skyscraper. It may be twice as expensive to build a skyscraper that you've doubled the height, because doubling the height adds tremendously to the complexity and the reinforcing at the bottom. So just overall, this formula allows you to predict based on different sizes of things. And so capacity or size is the Q variable, and then C is the cost variable, where you're trying to predict how much something will cost, this item 2, on the basis of a previous project that you've completed where you have a known expense. So you use that size extrapolation as well as in problem 8. It also asks you to use a time extrapolation. And we did already talk about the issue of how to handle time, where there are cost indexes that says what was the baseline price in a certain year, and then as time goes on, how you can account for the effects of inflation. And so in problem 8, you've got pricing data from a thing that is smaller and in the past, and you're trying to predict what would be the price of a larger thing in the future. So in the one problem, you're accounting for the passage of time as well as a difference in size. All right. So now we're moving on to depreciation and some topics from chapter 16. There's some terminology that's introduced in the textbook related to depreciation, and what it is the reduction in value of physical property over time because the equipment is becoming more worn out. And the reason why we care about depreciation from an accounting standpoint is that it has tax consequences. Businesses are allowed to deduct the effects of depreciation from their profits. And so it's a tax deduction if you have depreciation. So we all know the idea that a new car loses value really quickly. And the way that you can calculate the value of a car over time is beginning with its initial cost basis, which is the starting price plus any expenses having to put it into service, like training, installation, transportation. So that's the initial basis. And then over time, the book value is the value of the equipment from an accounting standpoint in each given year. And so the cost basis minus the depreciation is the book value. And it's important to point out that the book value may be different from the market value of equipment. The book value is just an accounting expression of how much of the original cost basis remains at any given time. And what people are willing to pay for a piece of equipment may be completely different from this kind of tax-focused book value. Now, there are a couple of different methods that our textbook introduces for calculating this effect of depreciation. The straight line method, declining balance, and the modified MACRS, modified accelerated cost recovery system. I had to remind myself what that abbreviation stands for. Yes, so we'll talk about each of these three today, but unfortunately this is going to be the one class meeting in the entire semester where we don't go over an in-class exercise. It's just going to be straight lecture today, folks. So hopefully you've rested your ears. The difference between straight line and declining balance depreciation is that in declining balance depreciation, you accelerate the effect of depreciation up front, and then later on the depreciation slows down. And so what businesses would prefer is they want to, from an accounting standpoint, have as much depreciation early on as possible. Because remember, a tax deduction now is more valuable than a tax deduction in the future. So if this depreciation is going to reduce how much tax you have to pay, then you'd rather take those dollars now when they have more purchasing power than some years in the future. Here's the formula for straight line depreciation. And what you can see is you start with the initial cost basis of the item, and you subtract out the salvage value that will exist at the end of its useful life, and then you divide it by the number of years that this period is going to be, that the equipment is going to be depreciating. And so it's called straight line depreciation because it assumes a linear reduction in book value over time. And so this formula will tell us what's the depreciation amount each year, and the depreciation amount each year is the same. Because it's straight line, you're assuming that it loses the same dollar amount each year of its useful life. And so then, therefore, the book value in any given year would be the starting cost basis minus the cumulative depreciation to date. So it would be how many years have occurred multiplied by the depreciation per year. So it's called straight line depreciation because if you plot the reduction in an item's value over time, it's linear and forms a straight line. So here's just an illustration of some equipment that's used for the processing of argon gas. And if it had an initial cost of $20,000, then we say that is B, the cost basis. So its starting cost basis at time 0 is $20,000. And if we know that after 5 years it has a salvage value of $5,000, then the depreciation in each year, including the third year, so this is saying find the depreciation in year 3, but the depreciation is the same regardless of which year you're in. It's just simply the starting cost basis minus the salvage value divided by the number of years. And so each year, this gas processor loses $3,000 of value. And so therefore, the book value in year 3 will be the starting cost basis of $20,000 minus 3 years of depreciation at $3,000 per year. And so it's lost $9,000 worth of book value during the first 3 years, and its book value at the end of the third year is $11,000. So this is straight line depreciation. And companies are greedy, so they thought of a better way to account for depreciation. And maybe it's more than just greed. You know, items do genuinely lose more of their value earlier on. So this is not a very realistic idea, the fact that there would be a straight line of depreciation. More realistic is that you lose a lot of value early, and then the reduction in depreciation slows down after that. And that's kind of why I think it's a great idea to buy a car that's maybe 3 or 4 years old, because you let someone else pay for that accelerated depreciation up front, and then the car still has many years of useful life after its first few years when most of the depreciation occurs. So declining balance depreciation is an approach that allows you to have an accelerated depreciation up front. And rather than having a constant number of dollars that are being lost each year, it is a reduction by a fixed percentage. So instead of, this example, we lost $3,000 each year. In declining balance depreciation, instead of saying it loses $3,000 every year, then it maybe would say you're going to lose 20% of the value every year. And so in the first year, it would be 20% of the original book value. In the second year, it would be 20% of the previous year's book value. And so that's why it's declining at a reduced rate. So there are a couple of different ways we can calculate the percentage that is being subtracted out of the value each year. There is a way to define it by a percentage, or if you know a salvage value at the item's useful life, then you can calculate that as well. So this formula is just saying that the depreciation amount in a given year is this factor D multiplied by the book value in the year before it. So if you want to know the depreciation in the first year, then you'd start out at the book value at times 0 and multiply it by this factor D. Now either way, the number of periods, n, is a part of the expression. And so how long this is, the useful life of the equipment is a factor in determining how quickly the book value is reduced. So you can find the book value for a given year. This, remember, is the depreciation in that given year, so the book value in a given year is the initial cost basis B minus 1, multiplied by 1 minus D, where D is either defined by a fixed percentage or by a salvage value to the power of T for that year. So let me show you an illustration. Let's say that there is a truck that cost $80,000 up front. And this truck has a useful life of 10 years. So that is N. B, the initial cost basis, is $80,000. So we want to know what is the depreciation and the book value over time, meaning for each year during the 10-year useful life, if we follow what's called 150% depreciation. And what that means, the 150%, is it means during the first year it is going to depreciate at 150% of what it would be if it was straight line. So it's going to be a steeper downward slope than if there was just a straight curve connecting the cost basis and the salvage value. And that's good for the company. They want to take as much depreciation as possible. And so that first year of depreciation is 150% greater than straight line depreciation would be. So that's going to be, we'll calculate it according to a percentage method, or completely separate. If we knew that the item was going to have a final salvage value of $10,000, then we'll calculate the depreciation curve based on that. So this is easily set up as a spreadsheet. Let me just walk you through the calculations here that illustrate. So we have 150% is a given, along with a 10-year useful life, the initial book value of $80,000. Now S is blank because this doesn't have a certain salvage value that's known up front. What we know up front is just simply what is the percent reduction in the first year compared to if it was straight line. So if it was straight line, then it would have $8,000 of depreciation in the first year if it was going down to 0. And so rather than that, you can see that the depreciation amount in the first year is $12,000. So that's 150% of the $8,000 it would be if it was depreciating to zero at the end of the 10 years. So that's kind of why it's called 150%. And so if you've got 150%, then it's 150 divided by 100 times n. And so the D factor is 0.15, and then we use that to calculate the depreciation in every given year with the formula down here at the bottom. So the depreciation amount in year 1 is 0.15 times the previous year's book value. Okay, so then that tells us it's 12,000 is the depreciation for the first year, therefore the book value is 68,000. And now in year 2, the depreciation amount is 0.15 times this book value. And so 10,200 is simply 0.15 times 68,000. And then we subtract out the 10,200 from the previous year's book value, and that's where 57,800 comes from. And we go through the entire process, and you end up with some salvage value at the end of the 10 years. Now, one thing that the companies don't love about declining balance depreciation is it never gets all the way to zero. The equipment never depreciates to a salvage value of zero, and they would prefer to take as much depreciation as possible. And so from an accounting standpoint, they want the item to be appearing on paper as though it's completely worthless, because then they could take more tax deductions. So that's just kind of foreshadowing for the third method I'm going to show you in just a moment. But in part B, instead of using the percentage basis for calculating this lowercase d, we're using a known salvage value. And so instead of using the percent formula, we use this formula where S is the salvage value, B is the initial cost basis, N is the number of years. And so we've calculated that D is 0.1877. And so then each of these rows is calculated the same way as what I was describing for part A, where this depreciation amount in year 1 is 80,000 times 0.1877. And then the book value is the previous year's book value minus this year's depreciation. And it goes through year by year, and then you can see it confirms that your values are correct if you get to the known salvage value at the end of the 10-year time horizon. Now, the modified accelerated cost recovery system is a hybrid of those two methods because it does two things that the businesses like. It allows the equipment to depreciate to zero, which is great because they want to take as much depreciation as possible, and it also depreciates quickly. And so it begins with double declining balance depreciation, which is that steep depreciation curve that means you're taking more of the depreciation earlier on in the item's useful life. And then it has to switch over to straight line depreciation in order to depreciate to zero. So it's a hybrid method that combines the elements of both of those previous techniques that are most advantageous to businesses. It uses standardized recovery periods according to what kind of equipment we're talking about. And so there are these categories, and the government defines how long an item is going to last on the basis of what kind of equipment it is. For instance, carpet will just have a certain given depreciation period, and heavy equipment for water treatment will have a different depreciation period. And rather than going to the manufacturer of the equipment and asking them how long the item is going to last, it just goes by category. I'll show you in a moment what some of those categories are. Now, one kind of odd thing about this modified accelerated cost recovery system is that you may think that the government's being pretty generous, right? Like they are allowing businesses to depreciate early at a steep rate as well as depreciating to zero. And so both of those are pretty friendly to businesses. But what the government did was they kind of closed one small loophole that was being abused, and that was sometimes businesses would buy equipment in December of a year, and then they'd try and use an entire year of depreciation, even though the item had only been owned for a month or even just a few days before the end of the year. So to get around that loophole, what the government said was you can only use half a year of depreciation in the first year. And so although these items have specified useful lives, they give you a half share of depreciation in the first year, and then they move a little bit of depreciation to the end of the useful life. And so they kind of assume that the item is being purchased in the middle of the year. So you get a half share of depreciation in the first year and in the final year. So I'll show you what that looks like when we look at the tables. Now here are those categories though. This is where I told you that instead of the item's useful life being tied to how long it'll actually last, it's just there are these definitions, and there are a couple of different methods that are used when you're applying this accelerated cost recovery idea, GDS and ADS. Most of the problems in our book are based on the GDS system. And so, for example, if you buy a bus, then the GDS depreciation system says that the bus will have a useful life of 5 years. Okay? Or if we're talking about equipment that is used for electric utility steam production plant. So it's like a coal-fired power plant, and it's the equipment that's used to produce steam for electricity production, then that equipment lasts for 20 years. And so you could have to spread out its reduction in value over a 20-year period. So businesses like to have as low a recovery period as possible, because then that means that the depreciation happens early on when the dollars are more valuable. Now here are the tables that show you what percentage of the value is lost in which year. And so in the previous example, I was just saying a bus lasts for 5 years. And so let's go with the idea of a bus. So a bus is pretty expensive. Let's say it's a $100,000 bus. Okay, so if you buy a $100,000 bus, what this is saying is it's a 5-year recovery period. And so even though it's a 5-year recovery period, you'll notice it goes through 6 years. And that's because of the half share thing I was telling you about, where they have only a half portion of depreciation in the first year, and then there's an extension of the recovery period into a 6th year. Okay, so a $100,000 bus loses $20,000 worth of value in year 1. It loses $32,000 worth of value in year 2, $19,200 in year 3, and now this is where it's switching over to straight line. Remember, I mentioned that it starts with a nonlinear curve where it's a really steep depreciation curve up front, but then when it switches to a linear straight line depreciation, then you'll see there are a couple of years where the amounts are the same, and then the last year it's a half portion. And so this 0.576 is half of the year before that. So, you know, in the 20 year, it's maybe even more obvious that there's a lot of depreciation early on, but then it basically goes to a straight line depreciation for several years, and then finally in the last year there's half of a year of depreciation. So that's just a little bit of detail about depreciation, and in a normal semester where we had a bit more time, we'd do an in-class exercise, you'd get some practice with these methods, you'd have some homework problems that had to do with depreciation, but I guess at the very least now you understand just a beginning amount about what depreciation is and how it's calculated. All right, let's talk about taxes now. And there's been a lot of tax discussion here in West Virginia recently because the legislature is thinking about increasing the sales tax in West Virginia to be the highest in the nation. In the past, our sales tax here has been relatively moderate, if not fairly low. There are some states that have no sales tax, but back in 2018, West Virginia's average combined state and local, meaning, you know, how some localities like Huntington adds 1% on top of the state's 6%. So on a statewide average, we were 32nd in the country. But there's been a proposal that they should increase the sales tax in order to decrease the income tax here in West Virginia. So it'll be interesting to see where things land on that. Sales taxes are a little bit rudimentary because it puts all of the taxation burden onto the person who buys a finished product. Ordinarily, raw materials don't have a tax due. It's just the finished product. And there are some incentives for tax avoidance in sales tax that can be avoided if you switch to what's known as a value-added tax instead. Most of the rest of the world uses value-added taxes rather than sales taxes. And let me just step you through what a value-added tax is. It's a little bit complicated to understand at first, but the advantages is that it spreads out the burden of taxation onto more people. And so everyone is kind of paying their equal share instead of the final consumer taking all of the burden as you get with the sales tax. So in a value-added tax, we're going to use this illustration of the supply chain that turns cotton into a shirt. And so there's different steps in this process, and different people are doing certain things to turn raw cotton into a shirt. And in a normal sales tax, the only person who would pay is at the very end. It would be the final purchaser who contributes to the government. But the idea of taxation is that we're all chipping in so that we can have a society, so that there is financial support for a government who provides safety, who manages the level playing field, who prepares the infrastructure that we all rely on, such as roads and water distribution, and that manages and regulates pollution and that sort of thing. So since everyone in the supply chain benefits from the existence of society and benefits from a government that enforces laws and safety standards and environmental protection, I kind of feel like everyone should chip in because everyone's benefiting from the system that we've got. So that's the rationale behind a value-added tax. Now let's talk about the calculations and how it works. So a farmer grows cotton and is selling that cotton to a textile maker for $1. I don't know how much cotton, let's say a bag of cotton. So that bag of cotton, if there's a 10% value-added tax, then the farmer is going to charge the textile maker $1.10 because the purchase price was $1, the value-added tax is 10%, and so then the 10%, the 10 cents in a dollar that the farmer grows should be given to the government. Now, the next step is that the textile maker is going to take the cotton and they add value to it. What that means is they transform the cotton into something that's more valuable than it was before they did their thing. And so they're taking raw cotton and turning it into fabric. And in the process of doing it, that bag of cotton that used to only have a value of $1 now has a value of $5 because that's what the textile maker is able to sell it to a clothes maker for, $5. And so if $5 is the selling price, then they would actually collect $5.50. Now the interesting thing is that the textile maker gets reimbursed for their previous 10 cents that they paid to the farmer, because you're only being taxed not on the total amount, but you're being taxed on how much value you added in the previous step. And so the net amount that the textile maker has to give to the government is 40 cents because the difference was they went from $1 to $5 in value, and so the 10% tax is paid on how much additional value the textile maker has added to the process. And so 40 cents goes to the government, and the textile maker gets to keep the 10 cents as reimbursement from the previous tax that they paid. So likewise, in the next step where the clothes maker is going to buy the fabric from the textile maker and then turn it into clothes and sell those clothes to the retailer. So the retailer pays $12, which means the item increased in value from 5 to 12 when it was sewed together and fitted to a shirt and looks nice, it's great fashion. There's an additional $7 of value there. And so you'll see in the end, it's going to be 70 cents that the clothes maker has to give to the government because that's 10% of the value that they've added. So it's a $12 selling price, but the clothes maker is going to collect $13.20 because it's $1.20 of tax, which is 10% of the $12, and so they're getting reimbursed the 50 cents of tax that they paid before, and they're only having to turn in the 10% of the value that was added. And so you can see that, it's an idea that maybe the first couple of cycles you have to think and scratch your head a little bit about and see how it works. But then in the end, you see that everyone's contributing a share that's proportional to the value that they've added. And then the final item that was sold for $20, a total amount of $2 of value-added tax has been collected. It's just at different stages in the process where more value was being added. Everyone contributed at a rate that's proportional to how much value was added by the step that they undertook. So it's really an interesting idea, and is by far the most widespread method of collecting tax when there is a retail situation. So that's a value-added tax. Now we also have other kinds of taxes that are specific to different types of items. Like a gasoline tax is a type of excise tax. An excise tax is something that applies specific based on the category of items, like cigarette taxes, gasoline, alcohol. There are special taxes that just apply to those particular things, and those are called excise taxes. And so gasoline is a type of excise tax. Here in West Virginia, as of 2017, our total state tax was 32 cents. And there's also a federal tax of 18.4 cents that applies. But it's kind of interesting to look from state to state how different things are. Like in Pennsylvania, their fuel tax just on a statewide basis is 58 cents. But not far away in Virginia, it's only 22 cents. So if you live close enough to the border, you may be better off to go to Northern Virginia to buy your fuel, potentially. I've noticed it the most when I've flown into Charlotte and driven down to South Carolina, because South Carolina has about 20 cents per gallon less in state fuel taxes, and as soon as you drive across the border, suddenly fuel is cheaper. And so it's definitely noticeable. Here in West Virginia, there's a concern that because people are driving more fuel-efficient vehicles now, that there's less revenue coming into the state for roadway maintenance. I'm sure if your roads look anything like the ones that I drive on, they're in pretty bad shape. And the state could use a little bit more revenue to help round out its budget and allow for more resurfacing and more often repair to potholes. And so to try and to collect more revenue, they've started to charge a little bit more for hybrids and electric vehicles to register their cars. And so, a hybrid uses less fuel, so it pays less tax. And so they're starting to think about, how are they going to fund highway infrastructure when people buy less fuel or no fuel. A cigarette tax is a special kind of value-added tax. And back in 2018, you can see what the cigarette taxes were in each state. And historically, the cigarette taxes have been the lowest in states that grow tobacco. They've been the most reluctant to levy high taxes on cigarettes. And so if you look at Kentucky and Virginia and Missouri, you'll notice that southern states where tobacco is grown generally have relatively low cigarette taxes, but then states that are more focused on covering the cost, the healthcare costs of smoking, like California, Washington, New York, they've raised it quite a lot. And I think that these are, this is from 2018, and it's gone up since then in most states. So overall, excise taxes, remember, are those kinds of taxes that are used to, that are applying just to specific items like alcohol, tobacco, lottery tickets. Usually excise taxes can be thought of as taxes that are on luxuries or on unnecessary things. Although I guess you could argue that gasoline is hardly a luxury. It may be the exception, but in a lot of other cases, sometimes excise taxes are known as a sin tax, where it's a special tax that's applied to things that you want to discourage the consumption of. So we've talked about excise taxes already and sales taxes. One more thing we're going to take a look at today are property taxes. And property taxes are independent of what you're actually doing with the item. So it's sometimes tricky for people when they get into their older years, if they have a really nice big house or a large piece of property and then they're not working anymore. The property taxes can be tough for them to keep up with when their income is reduced during the retirement years. And so a lot of states, including West Virginia, have special property tax reductions and exemptions for people who are over a certain age. Unfortunately, because we're pressed for time, we're not going to get a chance to go through income taxes, but in the coming years, if you haven't already had the pleasure of filing an income tax return for yourself, you will get that opportunity soon. I just filed my income taxes last weekend, and I owed both the federal government and the state government a little bit more money because I hadn't been taking out enough from my paychecks. So it's more fun to get a refund, but all right, this is where we're going to finish things, is talking about property taxes. And here in Cabell County, we have relatively low property taxes. We're fairly fortunate. You can look up the tax rates. Let me show you what those tax rates look like. Just opening a web browser. Let me drag it over. All right, so in Cabell County, the tax rates vary depending on where you live. If you live in a city, your property taxes are generally higher than if you live in a rural area. So you'll notice, for example, that Huntington has a higher tax rate than in the rural areas. And that's because the city of Huntington offers more services than people in rural areas. Huntington has its own police force, has its own fire department, whereas where I live, we've got police services are provided by the sheriff, and I think there are fewer of them per square mile or per capita than they have in Huntington. And the fire services are from the volunteer fire departments rather than like paid city firefighters. And so the other thing I want to point out is that the rate that's charged depends on whether it is occupied by the owner or whether if a property is rented. So in Huntington, Class 2 is the tax rate that's paid by owner-occupied properties, and Class 4 is how much tax is paid when a property is occupied by renters. Now, I don't know what the justification or the rationale is for charging more tax when when a house is being rented, because the landlord is simply going to turn around and incorporate the cost of those taxes into the rent. And so it's kind of like this is an indirect penalty on people who rent their homes rather than who own the home that they live in. But anyways, so this number is a percentage, and it's the percentage of the value that has to be paid each year in tax. And so the formula is that you start off with the appraised value of the home, multiply it by 0.6, and that's what's called the assessed value. I don't know why they bother breaking it up into an assessed and an appraised value, but they do. And so you determine the assessed value, and then you multiply it by that factor we were just looking at, divided by 100, and that's the property tax that's due for a year. So for instance, let's say an owner-occupied home in Huntington is appraised at $150,000. That's like what its sales price would be. So if the actual appraised value of the house is $150,000, then the assessed value is 60% of that. So the assessed value would be $90,000, and then the tax that's due is 1.652% of the $90,000 each year. So the property tax would be $14.86 per year. And the property taxes are used largely to fund the school systems. That's where, more than anything else, the property tax goes to. But it also funds the libraries, the EMS. It goes for the county health department. And there are some economic development funds that get their financing from property tax, as well as programs for seniors like Meals on Wheels. And so I always feel pretty good about paying my property tax. I feel less good about paying income tax, but you know, since it's services here in the community where I live, and I feel pretty good about the services and think they're being managed fairly well, I never mind paying my property taxes. So listen, we're out of time. It's 12:59. This is the end of the semester. I've really enjoyed teaching this class this semester. And my only regret is that we didn't get to sit in the classroom together, because I think that would have made it even a little bit better if we'd been able to look into each other's eyes and ask questions more freely and answer your questions about the in-class exercise with a little bit more accuracy. So, you know, I regret that we had to do things virtually this semester, but I have to say I'm just really impressed with the effort that people have put in. And there are people who are listening right now that they didn't miss a single minute of the entire semester, and I think you really should be applauded for managing to maintain your discipline and focus through a virtual semester. If you can get through this last academic year, you're going to sail through the future when you've got more resources and it's less dull than sitting in front of a computer all day. So that's it. Thanks, everyone. Remember that the final exam will open up on Blackboard on Friday the 30th at 11:15 a.m. Take care.